be when you grow up? We'll talk about this and spiritual formation today on the Praxology podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church. We're interested in assisting European leaders to think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally. In this episode, we'll begin to look at a very popular topic right now, like everyone's interested in: coaching, spiritual direction. So we're focusing on spiritual formation and talking about what exactly is it today. As a reminder, this podcast is a collaboration between Josiah Venture and For Mission College, a European campus. I am your host, Sean Smith, with Tyler Patty, as always.
Hey, how's it going?
It's great. It's great to be back in the studio. So, Tyler.
Yes.
Who did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, it depends on when you would ask me. I think that as a kid, I wanted to be a builder. My dad was a great builder. He helped me build tree houses. He built a hotel, sort of. He helped design a rebuild of a conference center here up in the mountains of the Czech Republic.
Dave Patty is a man of many, many things, and I'm not surprised to hear this.
So builder. Later on, I wanted to be a rock star. So as any teenager wants to be. So, we all have these images out in front of us of who we want to become, who we want to be like, and it helps to have something concrete, because it's one thing to talk, well, I want to be smarter, I want to be healthier, that can mean lots of things, but to have something concrete out in front of you can really help focus your attention on the right thing. So, and that's really what people like Abraham Heschel, who's a Jewish theologian, writer, just an amazing person. He states that what determines one's being is the image one adopts. What determines one's being is the image one adopts. And he wrote that in his book, Who is Man? So this is totally tied in. You set yourself up, set an image in front of yourself, and that determines who you're going to be, who you're going to become. Some other theologians and philosophers have built on this idea, like James Smith, amazing.
We've referenced him before.
We have
this podcast. Yeah.
A Christian philosopher who wrote a book called "You Are What You Love," which is kind of self-explanatory, but basically he argues that we're most driven by our affections, not by logic, and so most often our actions are determined by the things that we love, more often than even the things that we believe or that we think. If I love my wife, I'm going to spend time with her. I'm going to be devoted to her. It's not necessarily your affection drives your focus in life. And so similarly, if you love your job, then you're going to give yourself to it, and that's the direction you're going to go. So this kind of all plays into this topic of spiritual formation, and what image are we setting in front of ourselves? What do we most desire? Who do we want to become?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, that image that we're looking at is what gives us vision, and from vision we create like mission statements and things like that. So that's really transformative for our entire being, not just our minds, but we literally have to use our feet and walk towards that vision, and act that and participate in becoming like that thing. That's to use some really technical words there that we're gonna introduce a little bit later on. Let me maybe just mention here Dallas Willard. I think this quote's really key in helping us turn in a very Christian direction with spiritual formation, because spiritual formation could be just some broad, nebulous, out there kind of thing for some people. We want to be distinctively Christian and reflect on it theologically. So he says, Dallas Willard, in Spirit of the Disciplines, a wonderful text, he says, we can become like Christ by following him in the style of life he chose for himself. And that's a great quote. Like we look to Jesus. We want to become like Jesus when we grow up. In our spiritual faith and in maturity. That's Paul uses that language. That's fair to say. We can become like Christ by not only looking to him, but also remembering what he did when he was on earth, and look to those practices and seek to emulate or imitate those, just like our like my son, your sons look up to you, and they do things good and bad that are like, wow, I can't believe I do that, and he's copying me.
Absolutely.
So if we're looking to Jesus, then we're in a way we want to copy him as he is helping us do it through the power of the Spirit. It's fair to say that Jesus was also looking to the Father. Some fun Trinitarian stuff happening there that we'll just let fly by. He turned to the Father in prayer countless times, to say the least, though. And inherent in the quote from Willard is the assumption that to grow spiritually, we embody and take on the practices of Jesus. It's more concisely what I was talking about. So we do what Jesus did in order to be holistically formed for missional presence and action. Jesus is our model, and he did practice the spiritual life.
Yeah.
In the power of the Spirit, self-consciously. Luke 4, was it 18? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, when he's in the temple. So there's also connection to doing and to being, something that's really, really important to us on this podcast that we're really building into, broadly thinking about theology beyond just spiritual formation. And we see that he does mention become. We can become, says Willard, we can become like Christ. And that's a process. So spiritual formation, that process of becoming. And if we're becoming like something, that means we're following it. So it's really important that our vision, who do we want to be like when we grow up? Like that actually is a valid question and sort of a fun way to put it as well, to help us conceive of, I wanted to be a firefighter when I grew up. Well, what was that like? How did that transform you? Well, it transformed the way you played. I guarantee it. And my son, he's all the time police, firefighter, this type of thing, because that's what he wants to be when he grows up. So yeah, but that's moving maybe a little bit too far forward. So Tyler, let's move now into some metaphors, some categories, to begin thinking about. If we're going to talk about spiritual formation, should we probably just define it first? Like
Absolutely.
what is spiritual and how is it forming something?
And I think that's a really important place to start, because there's one thing to talk about formation and personal growth and personal development, but it's a whole nother thing to talk about spiritual formation in the context of our relationship with Christ. We've all seen countless self-help books on the shelves of bookshelves, and maybe even have benefited from them. But there's nothing distinctly Christian about a self-help book. And I know that research on Generation Z shows that Gen Z people are actually really, really motivated by personal growth, personal development.
Yes.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that development and growth is Christian or is spiritual. So we need to really reflect deeply on what does it mean to grow into Christ's likeness. What does it mean to engage in spiritual formation? And what does it mean to practice true spirituality as well? What role does do the practices of the church play? For example, it's kind of trendy to be spiritual but non-religious. And so is that possible? Can I grow spiritually without being attached to a community or by following practices? These are all questions we need to ask.
Yeah, and we do hear that all the time, don't we? I'm spiritual, but I don't like the organized religion stuff. And to an extent, we just have to listen and say that's fair, because there are some inherent difficulties with the organized nature of religion, especially Central and Eastern Europe, and a lot of that is valid. So we need to, I think, pause and just listen really, really well when people do say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then try to assist in moving into a more formative direction, looking to Christ and seeing how he did place himself within community on purpose. Anyway, we're sort of jumping the gun and assuming a definition of spiritual formation, but you're right. Like we do have to ask the question, like, why does it matter? Why should we care? And it's because we hear phrases like this all the time. Like I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. So we need to have a vision for spiritual formation, to think theologically about it, so that we don't just devolve or like spiral downward into adding a practice for this season of my life because
Yeah, that's right.
I really need it, or just something to get me through the day.
If I can add something there, I listened to an interview with a Jewish writer for like the New York Times and stuff, and she wrote a piece recently on, I think the title was why your technological Sabbath won't actually help or something like that. But like it's trendy for people in the tech world to say, oh, well, like I need a tech Sabbath, need to disconnect from things. But she argues that that's not actually going to solve anything. Turning off your phone for a day doesn't actually engage in the deeper underlying issues of your formation, your character growth, and things like that. And that also it detaches itself. That practice is then detached from the community, which gives it meaning as well. So I just thought of that right now. That's kind of what we're talking about. It's not just I'm going to do this. It's going to help me for a little bit, and then I'm going to go back to my normal life. We need to think more deeply about what does it mean to walk in the Spirit and to grow in the community of God into Christ-likeness.
Yeah, and to continue that in Silicon Valley, I've also read, I don't know if it was in the New York Times quote and stuff that you said, but places like that where CEOs in Silicon Valley, tech capital of at least the United States, I don't know if we can say world or not, if that's fair, but that's where a lot of the Apple, a big, huge, majorly influential companies,
basically
companies,
countries. Yeah,
Apple is its own country, perhaps.
That's right. Has a budget of a small country,
at least. Yeah, but they, at the level of like CEOs, have realized some of the problems that their products create, and that they actually force their kids to not just have a tech Sabbath, but have like multiple Sabbath days a week against it, because they know. And I think that's maybe to be fair, they are thinking at a little bit deeper of a level and trying to be truly formative and teach their kids how to use it in a healthy fashion. But that leads to the point for Christians. The spiritual life is one lived in the world before the face of God and guided by the Spirit. It's not something that we just do one day a week. We do rest intentionally one day a week, but it's more than that. Those practices have to be holistic. They're connected, and they ultimately form our being. We can't just put aside our phone one day a week and hope that something else will be transformed, because just by doing math, that's only 24 hours, and there's way more hours than that in a week.
That's right.
It doesn't compute. But I mean, we're not mathematicians here. So we need to have this vision, I think, of spiritual formations more than just practices. It's holistic.
Yeah.
That's sort of where we're landing. Spiritual for a Christian is a life lived. It's entirely embodied. So to be planted by streams of living water, our spiritual practice must shape and form us continually so that they spill over into daily life, and sort of become like a type of liturgy. Like our life becomes a liturgy, a living sacrifice before the Lord that shows Jesus to people.
Yes.
So what's of further interest here is really kind of the moment we live in. There's great focus on, in Protestantism, evangelicalism, whatever word we want to use to describe essentially the same thing, though they are different, to be down to earth and adopt sort of like low church practices. Like we have no structure here, very, very minimal structure. So
to be authentic.
Yeah. Which is great. But it ends up with adopting low church norms, having no structure. I think we must give some theological reflection to our practices as a church, because they are communicating something. So everyone wants spiritual formation stuff, but they don't want church structures that actually help them to do it, which is just fascinating to think about. As
if growth is something you can stumble into.
Yeah.
Well, this is interesting here. So let's have a little quote by Friedrich Nietzsche, maybe the most unlikely person who might have something to say to this particular issue. In Beyond Good and Evil, he says, "The essential thing in heaven and earth is that there should be long obedience in the same direction. Thereby results, and has always resulted in the long run, something which has made life worth living."
It's incredible.
It's pretty
he said
incredible. That. Yes. So our life needs to be characterized by a certain rhythm and pace, and stability in by going in the same direction. There's movement. We're not static, but we need to focus our eyes ahead on the right things and then go. And you're grabbing a great book. So not Jordan.
Yeah, those on YouTube you can see the book I just pulled it, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction.
Yeah, so
from Eugene Peterson.
Yeah, so Eugene Peterson uses this as a title for his book, and his book is not on nihilism or anything like that.
No, it's not.
No. But he uses the same phrase, a long obedience in the same direction, as a means of characterizing what it means to walk as a disciple of Jesus, what it means to grow spiritually. And as his guide, he follows the Ascent Psalms, the Psalms of Ascent, which is Psalm beginning with Psalm 120 and onward. It's one of the most unique collections of Psalms because they're all basically grouped together with the same heading, and they're the Psalms of Ascent, and they were used most likely as pilgrim psalms, as journeying psalms. And so as Israel would be traveling from the far corners of their tribes to come and worship in Jerusalem, going up, that's what ascent means, going up to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices, they would be singing these psalms as they go. And it's so interesting looking at the commonalities in between these psalms, and they're very down to earth. They're very, very ordinary, but they bring God in. They bring God's perspective into the ordinary, the ordinary of family, the ordinary of work, of agriculture, and of worship as well. And so by singing these and repeating these on the journey, we can imagine that they were actually being formed by these things. And so he talks about that the Christian life is one of a long obedience in the same direction, just like these pilgrims model for us in the Psalms.
Yeah, and it is interesting that the title of the subtitle of that book is Discipleship in an Instant Society. So he's sort of recognizing what we've been talking about and saying, no, it's like we need to use the Psalms of Ascent because who are we looking towards? Well, we're looking to God. We're literally going up to worship Him, and we're going to let that transform us in the process. And so the Psalms of Ascent really help to cultivate the heart, and it's doing more than just preparing to enter the presence of God and to worship Him. That practice in and of itself is doing something within that community who's practicing it. So that's something that we shouldn't miss. Spiritual formation happens on the journey of life. Yes. So we like the idea of obedience, of journey, but this is actually a definition of discipleship, really, that Peterson's using, and not spiritual formation. So Tyler, before we try to like land on a definition and move through some other theologians who have them, is spiritual formation the same thing as discipleship?
Yeah, that's
something that we've assumed sort of up to this point. We need to unpack.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think it'd be helpful to look at some. We could think about this and speculate, but let's look at some actual definitions of spiritual formation and see where they overlap or differ from our notions of discipleship. So, for example, Jordan Aumann, is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
Okay. Jordan Aumann in Spiritual Theology takes a more mystical approach and says that Christian spirituality is a participation in the mystery of Christ through the interior life of grace, actuated by faith, charity, and the other Christian values. So he agrees that spirituality, it must be connected to God. It's participation in the mystery of Christ, but also that there are certain practices that form and shape that life. So really his focus here is on the forming of Christian values, which is a part of discipleship, but not its entirety.
Yeah, so discipleship is more of a bigger encompassing term of which forming Christian virtues or values is a subset of.
That's right. Yeah. So that's helpful. So discipleship is probably the larger category under which spiritual formation should be subsumed. And yeah. So, okay, here's another one. Tyndale University in Canada defines spiritual formation as, quote, a process of becoming more Christ-like. Very succinct.
Amen.
Very succinct, very straightforward.
Almost so straightforward it's kind of not helpful.
Yeah.
But it is helpful all the same.
It is helpful. Out. So, but even, okay, like a process of becoming more Christ-like. Even they're choosing their words very carefully with such limited space. It's interesting that it uses the phrase "a process of becoming," as if there is a journey inherent to this thing.
Yeah, and the focus is not just a process and the end result of the process.
That's right. That's right.
Doing the process helps us become like the end result.
That's great. One more definition from the Renovare team, which was founded by Richard Foster. We have his book up here, Streams of Living Water, and he's written on spiritual disciplines. And actually in JV, we have a teammate who is going through the Renovare program on spiritual formation. So we might have him on one of these days and get to share his
that's a nice teaser. I hope we can make that happen because it'll be fun to see what he has to say about spiritual formation from going through a program that Richard Foster created. He's like the guru in the most positive sense of that word for what we're talking about.
So they talk about spiritual formation as, quote, the formation and conformation and transformation of the human personality, body, mind, and spirit into the likeness of Christ. There's also an elaborative article that we'll put in the description that we think is really comprehensive, that unpacks some of this language about spiritual formation. What do you think about that final definition?
Yeah, it's a great definition. It certainly is doing a lot. It's very theological in its formation, like of the definition itself, right? Which is add as many little things as possible and make them very technical. But
the more shun TION words we can use in a definition, the better.
Yeah, especially in the world that I live in, systematic transformation theology. Yes.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, this definition is part of a broader article that we will link in the description. It's well worth a read. It's 10 counsels in spiritual formation. So it's very straightforward. One of those counsels, I guess, to use their word, is that they say literally, quote, do not aim at outward action. And so I think I somehow have this like knee-jerk reaction against this definition, though I really, really like it. And I'm like, something's not right here. And I for those on YouTube, you're getting me using my hands a lot today. I don't know why, but I keep raising my hand. I guess I'm somehow excited about this or something. Do not aim at outward action. Point taken. Spiritual formation is not. We don't want to be Pharisees. Like that wouldn't be good.
We also don't want to be pragmatists either. It's just like doing things that are going to be useful.
Yeah. And focus on outward action of spiritual life is most possibly Pharisaical in its attitude. It doesn't have to be, but I mean, we are fallen in our distorted images of God, and so that's likely a good possibility. But the point of spiritual practices is to form the inner human spirit via conforming to the indwelling Holy Spirit, consistent with the Renovare definition that we've mentioned. However, leaving out something on action seems as if spiritual formation becomes trapped in the inner world, as if it's just something for my inner psychology, which it is that, but it also has to be more than that, because we are not just individual Christians in the world. At the same time, the point of forming our inner lives is to become more Christ-like, which involves the connection of being with doing. We saw Jesus do that. He spent time with the Father, and it thrust him into action, like so many times. So there's a connection here, and we don't want to do a pendulum swing and add what is it? Do not aim at outward action and say, oh, it's all about outward action. It's not. It's primarily about the inward affections being grown, if I can use Jonathan Edwards' language. But it has a focus towards the outward. And especially since spiritual formation inherently does have community practice built into it. So that I think that has to be included in a definition somehow.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's certainly, don't hear us saying like this is the primary part of that definition. But Tyler, maybe move us forward.
Sure. Well, as a teaser for next episode, we're going to be looking at Abraham and how God sought to spiritually form him. And I think that we're going to see that this is definitely the case, that he was being formed not just for himself, but for the good of the world. And so that there is a formation, very important formation that is necessary, but it's not the end in and of itself. So our working definition for spiritual formation in the context of this podcast, which is really trying to bring mission to the forefront of our imaginations as we think
That's
about
important to know. Yeah.
think about our role as Christians in the world. So you might want to listen back to our biblical theology of mission from season 1 to kind of fill some of this in and give some context. But here's our definition. Spiritual formation is developing Christian presence to strengthen action through practices embedded in a local community. Shall I read it again?
Once more.
Okay. Spiritual formation is developing Christian presence to strengthen action through practices embedded in a local community.
There's so much that we can say on this, just on presence. But notice we have included to strengthen action, and it's emphasis on to strengthen, because the primary focus is on developing Christian presence, and we'll talk about and unpack a lot of what that means. Moving into some actual biblical examples of trying to prove our thesis in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's to speak academically about it, to show our case in the text of the Bible itself. Like that's one of the most major sources for theology, necessarily and rightly so. So we want to build out starting from there in next episode with Abraham, maybe looking at some of the Psalms to show what this is conceptualized as, this definition here in Scripture itself. So maybe we'll just finish in our final several moments here of unpacking what we mean by each phrase, each word.
That's great.
Yeah. So it's
So
you get us started.
I can start. Great. So the first word is developing. So developing Christian presence, and development, implies some sort of process and some sort of journey, and that's we're trying to tap into some of the previous definitions that we've talked about, and the importance of seeing this as a lifelong journey, as a long obedience, of developing Christian presence in the world through the power of the Spirit that dwells in us, keeping our eyes fixed on Christ. So that's not something that can be solved in a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of years. This is something we're developing, hopefully, for the rest of our lives.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add, theology is really important. Sometimes people talk about theology and then they talk about spiritual formation. And for some reason, people, I'm looking at some maybe on YouTube, hopefully you're not one of these people, who have this inherent bias against theology as if it's just some dusty old book on a shelf. Like, it is so much inherent in spiritual formation that we just, it's unfortunate we often assume it. But if we're just going to take the Psalms of Ascent, they're doing a practice that's forming them. They're looking to the image of God, literally going up to worship Him. That's transforming them, and they're also learning about God along the way.
They totally are.
There is so much that we can miss if we don't add explicitly theology into spiritual formation, because otherwise we're doing things. But we want to make sure that we're always looking to the right image. And if we're looking to the right image, how do we do that? Well, we need to know God better from His Word. And from what saints from the past have said, creeds, councils, these kinds of things become really important. So I just want to note theology is really, really important in aspect for talking about spiritual formation, something that oftentimes just gets left off, and I don't think it should.
Yes.
Maybe I'm biased. So developing Christian presence. Tyler's talked about developing, and we want to explicitly talk about that idea of Christian presence, which you did as well. The inclusion of Christian defines parameters of the entire point.
It does.
We're developing Christ-likeness through increased awareness with the Spirit. Maybe more to come on that later in the podcast because of my own personal research. The Spirit does the work, but spiritual practices help us to tune our ears to Him a little bit more.
Yeah. And the idea of presence is connected to what we see as a foundational concept from the Old Testament and the New Testament about being light in the world. You are the light of the world, which is taken up from Isaiah 60. That being one of the most powerful things that we can do and be is be light, and that requires a certain type of being and a certain type of presence in the world. So we've talked about that in our biblical theology, and we'll probably talk about it more.
Yeah, and then we want to use these things to strengthen action. It does have an outward. There is an outward dimension to this. And the focus is not on outwardly doing explicitly, like we've said, but it's saying that who we are becoming, I like that phrase, should come out in what we do and be reflected in the world, because that's what Jesus modeled, and we are becoming like Him. So our character and our being is caught up in our actions and missional lifestyle. It's something that has to be included for us to engage well with the world. And for us to engage well, we have to be spiritually formed. Again, that's really the point. So the goal of spiritual formation is not just to do practices so I can feel better about myself, so I can feel better about my relationship with God. And some of you listening might be going, well, that's not ultimately fair. That's a caricature. Yes, you're right. But you get hopefully you get the point of what we're talking about. Yeah. It does have outward component, even if it's not primary. So Tyler, end us with practices embedded in a local community.
So we already mentioned this briefly with the example from the tech world. We want to develop practices, but we can't do them in isolation. We need to think about how do those fit within the communities that we find ourselves in, and that means joining with the saints from the past and today and walking this journey together, because this is not a solo backpacking trip across the world. This is we as a community are fixing our eyes on Jesus, and we want to follow Him, and we want to be light in the world. And in order to do that, we need to make sure our values actually are reflected in our daily life, through practices, through the things that we do, through the things that we devote ourselves to, we spend time doing. And we'll talk about some of those practices in the episodes to come. And
so I remember the day that we were talking about spiritual formation because of this season on the podcast, and we sort of inherently stopped. We're like, so what exactly are we talking about? And we moved towards definitions. And we were thinking in a very integrative manner, if just like meta thinking about what we were talking about when we were in the office, and we were very much having a focus on like the point is to drive us to missional lifestyle, similarly to how the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness. He begins his ministry afterwards, and there is that component. It's thrusting us forward to join what God is doing in the world. And again, some of that language connects back to the biblical theology of mission. By all means, go back and listen to season 1. So let me just read one more time our definition. Developing Christian presence to strengthen action through practices embedded in a local community. So we couldn't be more excited. I think our hand gestures are proving it for those watching on YouTube, and for those not, just imagine us throwing our hands up a lot. We're excited to dig deeper into this aspect, and maybe join in with us. Please join in with us. This is Spiritual Formation's community practice, so we we want to do this in community rather than just be talking at you. We want to be talking with you. So let us know. Praxology at formmission. What is it? .org. .uk. Praxology at formission.org.uk. Apologies, I forgot. And tell us what you think of that definition. Again, it really is a working definition that we're using. In coming episodes, we'll fill out categories. Next episode, we're actually probably going to start with various dimensions of spiritual formation and move outward from there to Scripture. We'll break open some categories. That's what we like to do. Break open some categories.
We do like to do that. Yes.
Give some resources, especially some good resources. There are some really bad ones out there on spiritual formation.
Oh, yeah.
There's also some really, really good ones that I'm afraid many people maybe they don't know about. So we're going to try to uncover some of those things. And we'll also talk about items not always discussed in this realm. Tyler said just before we were filming, can we do an episode on patience? And I'm like, yes, we can, and that's part of the plan. So patience, things like pain and suffering, how do those form us? Community, we've begun that discussion already because we're so excited about that piece. Liturgy, connected with community, that has some negative baggage that we don't necessarily mean, but we'll talk about those things as well. Communication, spiritual formation as communication. That's an interesting one, especially if we're doing it in community. But we'll land it there for this episode. We say just go now in peace and in the power of the Spirit, who testifies to every spiritual blessing that we have in Christ, and think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.